All right, I get that might be becoming a bit repetitive, but even though I look at the U.S. stock market and I look at the Fed, hell, I hardly talked about Jackson Hole yesterday. I think I gave it a passing mention. Powell said there would be pain, that there was going to be a lot more pain. Yeah, duh. And frankly, what the Fed does is not the main factor at this point. It's what those damned Europors are doing. I hate to keep belaboring this point, but this is the biggest story in the Western world, and nobody in North America is talking about it. Well, until last night, I did notice finally Tucker Carlson did a whole segment on this, which was fantastic. I thought he did a great job covering what's going on in Europe with their energy. But Tucker's just one guy. His audience is not, 99% of America. I would go so far as to say that 99% of the country still has no concept of what is going on in Europe and how it's going to impact us. And frankly, it's going to have a much bigger impact, I think, than the Fed just hiking interest rates. And the Fed hiking interest rates, as far as I was concerned, could be apocalyptic for a bubble economy anyway, since the whole thing is a Ponzi scheme created initially by the Fed. Our economy in the United States is structurally on the brink of collapse, has been since 2008, and the Fed has been holding it together with Elmer's glue and Scotch tape. But the energy issue would be catastrophic for our economy, whether we were structurally disadvantaged or structurally disabled or not. Even if we had a perfectly stable and healthy economy, what the Europors are doing would have a catastrophic effect on us. And the reason for that is that, as I've stated, the American economy is very unstable. It will not take much to cause a systemic financial collapse, which will destabilize the real economy. But energy is the lifeblood of any economy, whether it be stable or unstable. A perfectly stable economy that gets its energy supply cut in half will, even under the best of circumstances, reduce in size by half. If you have an unstable economy, the effects of that drop in the supply of energy will result in a exponential collapse in your economy. If your economy is a perfectly stable machine that has a perfect ability to expand and contract based on how much energy, if your economy is running at 100% efficiency, in theory, you could expand. The economy would expand or contract arithmetically with the energy supply. But in our case, because we have a fundamentally unstable economy, disruptions in the energy supply and contractions of certain businesses will lead to an exponential collapse because we do not have the ability to infinitely scale our economy, up or down. We have contractual obligations, and we have zombie corporations that are sustained by low interest rate debt that is continually rolled over, as well as frivolous consumption that is stimulated by the federal government essentially printing money. Technically, I guess you could say it's the Fed that prints money or the commercial banks that print money, but nonetheless, it is the federal government that is spending this money into existence, putting it into circulation because they're, just issuing treasuries, and directly putting that money in people's pockets. They take that, then they go out and buy stuff, but that stuff takes energy to be produced. And so, because in our economy, demand and supply are not directly linked, we don't obey Say's law in that sense. In that, demand is a factor or a product of production. Consumption in our economy exists independent of production. and that manifests in the form of our absurdly high trade deficits, which have been sustained now, for 40 years. But in the end, while keeping all these variables in mind, I cannot possibly, calculate mathematically, how this is all going to play out. And after all, you have to include the human element here, as you do with any discussion of economics. So I can't tell you off the top of my head how all of this is going to play out and how these different variables are going to interact with one another. But what I can tell you is that this rapid destabilization of global energy markets, combined with rising interest rates, is a deadly combo. The pain that we're witnessing in Europe will not remain contained to Europe forever. There is a huge disconnect right now between North American electricity prices and the price of electricity in Europe. There was a viral tweet I saw today from apparently some bakery, I think it was, or a cafe in I believe Ireland, and they took a picture of their electric bill, and it said something like, I think it was 9,836 euros and 52 cents. I might have gotten that exactly correct. Might have a couple digits off there, but I think that's what it was. So almost 10,000 euros, which the euro now is, I think, worth slightly less than $1. So let's just round up and say $10,000 or 10,000 euros, in that range. Their electric bill for a small bakery or a small cafe, something like that. And they said, how in God's name could this happen? Yet the person, I don't know if they've changed it by now, but when I saw their username, their handle on Twitter, had a Ukraine flag emoji. And so that just shows you the disconnect in the minds of the average European. This is a person who was very happy. They put their little Ukraine flag on their Twitter account. I'm sure they put a Ukraine flag in the window of their store, and they were very supportive of all the sanctions on Russia, because they said, we got to stick it to Putin, or we got to sanction Russia and hurt them so that they can't afford to wage war on Ukraine. And look at the results. They cut off their own nose to spite their face. And there's no self-awareness. People in Europe, even when faced with the consequences, even when faced with financial ruination, these are people who are losing their dreams, their businesses, their livelihoods, everything that they've worked for their whole lives is being thrown away in a fruitless effort at virtue signaling, because that's what it is, against Russia. And even still, even as they're having to close their doors, these people, they don't understand what's going on. And so they're not going to change their ways. If they don't get it now, if it hasn't set in by now that electricity rates in France are 1,000 euros a megawatt. I talked yesterday, I think, about places where it was $600 to $700 a megawatt. Or euros, sorry, euros and dollars, though pretty much interchangeable now. That's insane. And why would it stay that way in Europe and not come to the United States? I'm not going to say that they're going to completely equalize. There is the bottleneck of the LNG terminals that I talked about, and that is our saving grace at this point. If there was a pipeline connecting North America to Europe, just as there's a pipeline connecting Russia to Europe, which has now been turned off, our electricity prices would equalize in time with Europe, because Europe then would just start consuming more of the gas from our side. And of course, the same would go for oil. Oil also travels in a pipeline. But nevertheless, even though Europe has all of these bottlenecks that are preventing it from taking as much energy from, importing it from non-Russian sources as they need, in time, they're going to be able to get that energy. They're going to be going out into the global market and buying up energy. And you see the prices that they're willing to pay. We're not talking about the financial, or not even the financial, the total economic and societal collapse of, Lebanon or Zimbabwe or Argentina. These are places that have had, these sorts of crises, whether they be, monetary crises or resource, supply side, mineral crises. But this is the entire continent of Europe. Plus, of course, Great Britain, which has, left. Brexit has happened, but they're just as, crazy anti-Russia as the rest of Europe. And so even though we're already in a recession here in the United States, things are going to get a lot worse. I don't think that we're ever going to be as bad off as Europe is going to be, but we're going to get a lot closer. And why the hell is nobody prepared for this? Why is nobody paying attention to it? The Fed is continuing to say, and echo and double down on what Powell said on Friday. They are determined to bring inflation down to 2%. I hope that they're right. I hope that they're being truthful about that. It's about time. But at the end of the day, this stuff is not all their fault. They can't control the idiocy of Europe. They cannot control the energy markets like this. They can't control the Biden administration trying to shut down the fossil fuels industry here in the United States. And so that means that they're going to have to hike rates a lot more than they would just to get rid of the monetary inflation in order to bring the rate of actual, the rate of observed inflation, the price increases. In order to bring that down, they're going to have to go overboard and crush demand, not just in nominal terms. They're going to need to crush it in real terms. They're going to have to actually withdraw money from the money supply. They're going to have to reduce the money supply, not just slow the growth of the money supply, because that will lead to a reduced demand for goods, which will account for the reduced supply. Because remember what I told you, in our weird, screwed up modern economy, demand exists independent of supply. In the olden days, in a classical economy, and by that I don't mean like classical economics, I mean like, before all of this financial engineering, demand would scale with supply, because what you were able to demand was only whatever you earned, whatever you produced. And therefore, in aggregate, supply and demand were equal. They were balanced. And so as people produced less, if there was a recession or something and people produced less goods, then they would have less demand themselves for other goods, because they would be taking in less income, and you wouldn't have to worry about prices. You wouldn't have to worry about inflation or deflation. It would all work itself out. But since demand for goods in this country is essentially determined by central planners, the Central Committee, the Politburo, i.e. the Federal Reserve Board, is going to have to reduce demand in order to account for this cliff that we've gone over, with regards to the supply of energy and the supply of consumer goods. Now, we're not even talking about the food supply. The largest producer of fertilizer in the world, which I think is in Norway, one of the Scandinavian countries, they've announced that because they have no natural gas, they're not going to be able to make fertilizer. They're going to reduce their annual production by 50%, because natural gas is essential for producing chemical fertilizer. And that is something that we in the United States can ship over to Europe. That is something that I think they're going to be, where prices will have to equalize. And fertilizer is already very expensive. It's quite scarce. So if we're having to split the fertilizer supply between the U.S. and Europe, both continents are going to just grow less food. You put less nutrients down into the soil, the plants can't grow as much, and so you have lower yields for your crops per acre. And so you know what that means: bread riots in Europe and potentially in the United States. I think that this will easily be the greatest crisis since the Great Depression, and I haven't even started factoring in my head the financial collapse yet, because that's really the main concern of what the Fed is doing, is that their actions will destabilize the financial system, and you'll have another, where in 2008 they pressed the pause button. right now what the Fed's doing is they're in the process of unpausing the 2008 collapse, and it's going to continue. Right at the same time when we have this manufactured European energy crisis. And hell, think about the contagion effects. If European banks start going belly up and European companies and whatnot, think of the counterparty risk with American financial institutions. Gosh, that's a whole element that just popped into my head. You know, Americans own European debt, and if the euro poors go bankrupt en masse, which it appears they're poised to do, you know, I don't care how big of a corporation you are. If the price of electricity, the price of energy, jumps, what is that, 1,000%? That's going to affect your bottom line. I don't think that your profit margins are that big. And so there's no way that I see that this bloodbath is contained to Europe. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.